Sometimes the world calls a man worthless only minutes before heaven places a key in his hand. The November rain came down softly over Mercer Repair, turning the gravel lot outside the service bays into a field of silver puddles and oil-colored reflections. Inside the shop, fluorescent lights hummed above tool chests, tire racks, and the open hood of an old station wagon whose heater had stopped working on the coldest afternoon Pine Hollow had seen that season. Ethan Walker stood beside the engine with his sleeves rolled to the wrist, his hands darkened by grease, his breath slow and steady. He was 40 years old, a white former Army mechanic with short brown hair touched by gray near the temples, a square face worn by weather and long silences, and light stubble that made him look a little older when the days were hard. His faded olive jacket hung on the back of a chair, his faded work shirt was smudged at the cuffs, his worn jeans carried pale dust from the shop floor, and his rugged boots had the look of boots that had walked through too many winters without complaint. Beside the bay door sat Atlas, his 6-year-old German shepherd, silver gray and cream coat clean against the concrete, amber eyes watchful beneath the simple dark working harness Ethan had repaired twice by hand. The station wagon belonged to a woman named Marcy Lane, a grocery clerk with 2 children waiting in the back seat under a blanket and a purse that looked too thin for another repair bill. Ethan had found the problem quickly: a loose connector, a tired fuse, an event motor that needed patience more than parts. He could have written it up the way Carl Mercer liked, padded the labor, added a diagnostic charge, and made the little repair sound expensive enough to satisfy the office. Instead, he cleaned the connection, replaced the fuse from his own spare kit, and let the heat breathe back through the vents. When warm air touched the windshield, one of the children smiled through the fogged glass. That should have been the end of it. But Carl Mercer had been watching from behind the office window, his arms folded, his tie too clean for a man who owned a repair shop. He stepped into the bay with a clipboard in his hand and a smile that sounded more like a locked door than a greeting. "Ethan," he said, "why does this invoice say no labor charge?" Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and kept his voice calm. It was a small fix. She needed heat. Carl looked toward Marcy, then back at Ethan. "People always need something. That does not make this place a charity." The other mechanic stopped moving. A socket rolled once across the bench and came to rest. Atlas stood, not quickly, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of a dog who knew when the air had changed. Ethan lowered the rag. "I fixed the car." Carl tapped the clipboard against his palm. "No, you gave away work that belongs to my business." Again. He reached into his folder, pulled out Ethan's time card, and dropped it onto the metal bench with a flat, final sound. "Clear your locker? You are finished here." Marcy whispered that she could pay something next Friday, but Ethan shook his head slightly before she could carry the weight of his trouble. It was not her fault. He had learned long ago that kindness often embarrassed the people who needed it most, because the world had trained them to expect a hook hidden inside every helping hand. Ethan did not argue with Carl. He did not raise his voice. He only walked to the small locker room, took down his jacket, folded an old army patch into his canvas tool bag, and packed the few things that proved he had ever worked there: a dented thermos, a pair of gloves, a photograph of his father's garage, and a roll of electrical tape he had bought himself. Everything fit into one bag. That was the part that hurt in a quiet way. A man could give years to fixing broken things and still leave with so little that the door barely noticed him passing through. When Ethan returned to the bay, Atlas stepped beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. Carl stood near the office with his keys in one hand. "You keep making soft choices, Walker, and life will keep paying you soft." Ethan looked at him then, not with hatred, but with the weary sadness of seeing a man mistake hardness for strength. Outside, rain tapped the roof in a patient rhythm. Ethan carried his tool bag to his old blue pickup at the edge of the lot. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat and sat upright, his amber eyes fixed on the shop windows. Ethan climbed in, closed the door, and opened his wallet. $4.18. Not enough for a motel. Barely enough for coffee and a small bag of dog food if he chose carefully. He leaned back and listened to the rain tick against the cracked windshield. Then his phone buzzed in the cup holder. The number was unfamiliar. Ethan almost let it ring out, but Atlas leaned forward and touched the phone with his nose. Ethan answered. "Mr. Walker," a woman's voice said gently, "this is Helen Brooks, attorney for the late Ruth Whitmore." Ethan sat straighter. Ruth Whitmore had been a quiet widow who lived beyond the old Apple Road, the kind of woman who remembered names and sent thank-you notes for things most people forgot. He had repaired her porch roof after a snowstorm the year before and refused payment because she was standing in the cold trying to do it herself. Helen continued, "Mrs. Whitmore left you something in her will. A property." Ethan looked through the rain at the glowing shop where he no longer belonged. "I think you may have the wrong man." "No," Helen said softly. She was very clear. "She left you the Whitmore washhouse, valued at $1, and she asked that your German shepherd be present when you receive the key." Atlas lifted his ears toward the phone, and for the first time that day, Ethan felt the strange stillness that comes just before a forgotten door begins to open. Ethan remained in the pickup for several seconds after the call ended, the phone resting in his hand while rain moved down the windshield in thin, crooked lines. The shop behind him still glowed with work lights, but it already felt like a place from another life, a room he had stepped out of and could never enter the same way again. Atlas sat beside him without moving, his ears still lifted toward the silent phone, his amber eyes bright with the strange patience that had carried them through parking lots, cheap campgrounds, cold mornings, and all the nights when Ethan had pretended he was only resting in the truck because he liked the quiet. A $1 property. A dead widow's name. A key that Ruth Whitmore had wanted placed in his hand only if his German shepherd was present. None of it made sense, but sense had not been especially generous to him lately. He started the engine, waded through the cough and shake of the old pickup, then pulled out of Mercer Repair with his canvas tool bag on the floor and Atlas watching the road ahead. Helen Brooks had asked him to come to her office before evening if he could. Her office sat above the Pine Hollow Savings Bank, in a narrow brick building with brass railings on the stairs and a hallway that smelled of paper, floor polish, and old raincoats. Ethan arrived just as dusk settled over Main Street, turning the storefront windows amber. He fed Atlas from the small bag of dog food he had bought with most of his remaining cash, then climbed the stairs with the dog close at his side. Helen Brooks opened the door before he knocked twice. She was a woman in her late 60s, slender, gray-haired, and composed in a navy cardigan, with careful eyes that seemed to hear more than people said. "Mr. Walker," she greeted him gently, then looked down at Atlas and gave the faintest smile. "And you must be the one Ruth insisted would understand first." Atlas stepped inside, sniffed once, and sat near the corner of Helen's walnut desk as if he had been expected. The office was warm, lit by a green banker's lamp and the low gold of a table light near the window. On the desk sat a cream-colored folder, a sealed envelope, a brass key, and a black and white photograph turned face down. Ethan stayed standing longer than manners required. He was still wearing his faded work shirt with grease smudges at the cuffs, worn jeans, rugged boots, and the faded olive jacket he had pulled on against the cold. Men like Carl Mercer made him feel dirty in rooms with polished wood. Helen seemed to notice, but she did not make a kindness out of it. "Please sit," she said. "Ruth would scold me if I made you stand." Ethan sat. Atlas remained beside him, shoulder lightly against his knee. Helen opened the folder and began with the formal words of the will, but her voice softened when she reached Ruth's personal note. "To Ethan Walker," she read, "who once climbed onto my porch roof in a snowstorm and refused payment because he said no widow should be left under a leak, I leave the Whitmore wash house and the ground on which it stands, valued for estate purposes at $1. Ethan looked down at the floorboards. Even alone with Helen, the number stung. $1 sounded less like a gift than a town's final joke. Helen turned the page. "There are conditions," she said. "For the first 72 hours, you may not sell, demolish, transfer, lease, or abandon the property. You must remain on the property tonight for the inheritance to vest. If you decline or violate the terms, the wash house transfers to the Pine Hollow Development Fund. Ethan looked up sharply. Carl Mercer supports that fund. Helen nodded once, very slowly. He is one of its largest private donors. Before Ethan could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, steady and familiar in their confidence. The office door had been left slightly open, and Carl Mercer appeared there with his raincoat folded over one arm, smiling as though every room eventually made space for him. "Helen," he said, "I hope I am not interrupting anything important." Helen closed the folder halfway. "This is a private legal meeting." Carl looked at Ethan, then at Atlas, then at the brass key on the desk. Word travels fast in a small town. Ruth's old washhouse is a burden, Ethan. Bad roof, no utilities, back taxes, probably raccoons in the walls. I can make the problem disappear tonight. He placed an envelope on the desk, thick enough to matter to a man with $4.18. $500 cash, he said. No shame in taking help when you need it. Ethan stared at the envelope. He thought of the truck heater, of Atlas's food, of his empty evening, of the cold creeping toward night. Then Atlas rose, crossed the small office, and placed one front paw beside the brass key, not touching the envelope at all. The dog looked at Ethan, calm and certain. Helen said nothing. Carl's smile thinned. Ethan reached past the envelope and picked up Ruth Whitmore's key. "I will stay the night," he said. The rain tapped the window softly, and in that quiet office above Main Street, something unseen seemed to choose him back. Carl Mercer's smile did not vanish when Ethan chose the key, but something underneath it tightened, the way a rope tightens before anyone hears it strain. For a moment, the office above Pine Hollow Savings Bank held only the soft ticking of the wall clock and the rain whispering against the window. Ethan kept Ruth Whitmore's brass key in his hand, feeling its worn edges press into his palm. It was heavier than it should have been, warmer than metal ought to feel in a room where the evening had turned cold. Atlas remained beside the desk, one paw still near the empty place where the key had been, his amber eyes fixed on Carl with calm attention. Carl looked at the dog first, then at Ethan, then at the envelope of cash he had placed on Helen Brooks's desk as if money itself had been insulted. 72 hours can feel very long when you have nowhere comfortable to sleep, he said softly. Ethan did not answer. He had slept in truck stops, under overpasses, behind closed garages, and once in a church basement where the furnace rattled like an old train. Comfort had never been the thing that frightened him. What frightened him was accepting the wrong kind of help and waking up owned by it. Helen picked up the cash envelope and handed it back to Carl without opening it. "Mr. Mercer, this meeting is concluded." Carl took the envelope, his polished shoes shifting on the old floorboards. He gave Ethan a final look, one that tried to seem sympathetic and failed. "Ruth always did enjoy puzzles," he said. "Just be careful you do not mistake an old building for a blessing." Then he turned and walked down the stairs, each step fading into the quiet below. Helen waited until the front door closed at street level before she moved. She crossed to the window and watched Carl's dark sedan pull away from the curb, its red taillights smeared by rain. Only then did she return to the desk and open the lower drawer. "Ruth expected him to come early," she said. Ethan looked up. "Carl?" Helen nodded. She did not say everything she suspected, but her silence had weight. From the drawer, she removed a second envelope tied with faded blue thread. Unlike the formal estate papers, this envelope looked personal, softened at the corners from years of being held and put away again. "Ruth asked me to give you this only if you refused the first offer." Ethan accepted it carefully. Atlas stepped closer, nose lifting as if he recognized the scent of old paper, cedar, and the faint trace of dried lavender. Inside were three things: a black and white photograph, a smaller folded note, and a brass washer no bigger than a quarter, stamped with the shape of an apple tree. Ethan unfolded the photograph beneath the green desk lamp. It showed the Whitmore washhouse decades earlier, long before moss climbed the brick and rain bent the wooden door. The little building stood behind an apple orchard in bright summer light, its tin roof shining, its chimney straight, its windows open. A young Ruth Whitmore stood beside a tall man in rolled-up sleeves, both of them smiling with the tired pride of people who had built something with their own hands. Near the rear wall of the wash-house was a round stone basin, and behind it, low near the floor, Ethan noticed a narrow vent or door that did not look like part of the main structure. In front of that spot sat a German shepherd with bright eyes and a pale chest, looking directly at the camera. Atlas gave one quiet breath through his nose and touched the photograph exactly where the dogs sat. Helen leaned forward. Ruth said her husband called that dog Moses, because he had a habit of finding passages where everyone else saw walls. Ethan turned the photograph over. On the back, written in Ruth's old hand, were the words, "Let Atlas listen where the water stopped." He opened the note next. "Ethan," it read, "if you are holding this, then you chose patience over fear. The wash house was never worth $1. That number was only for the people who cannot recognize value without a price tag. Go tonight. Let Atlas stand by the basin. Do not force the floor. Listen first." Ethan read the last line twice. Listen first. It sounded simple, but he knew simple instructions often carried the deepest trust. Helen gave him directions to the Whitmore property beyond Apple Road, then added a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and a folded wool blanket from the office closet without making a ceremony of it. Ethan accepted because pride felt smaller in the presence of Ruth's handwriting. By the time he and Atlas stepped back onto Main Street, the rain had thinned to mist. Pine Hollow storefronts glowed behind wet glass. The bank clock showed 7:15. Ethan placed the photograph on the dashboard of his old blue pickup, set the brass washer beside the key in the cup holder, and drove east past the last gas station, past the dark schoolyard, past the fields where fog gathered close to the ground. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, eyes not on the road but on the photograph. The pavement narrowed after 4 miles, then curved beneath bare apple trees whose branches reached over the lane like old hands. At the end of the orchard, half hidden behind a leaning stone wall, the Whitmore wash house came into view. Small, square, brick-faced, and weathered by years of silence, it stood under the mist with its tin roof dull as pewter, and its wooden door dark from rain. Ethan turned off the engine. The quiet rushed in. Atlas did not wait for a command. He stood, breath fogging the window, his gaze locked on the rear of the little building where the water had once stopped and something true had kept sleeping. Ethan sat in the stillness of the old blue pickup for a moment, letting the rain mist bead on the windshield, while the Whitmore wash house waited beyond the leaning stone wall. The little brick building looked smaller than he had imagined and lonelier than any property should have looked after being named in a will. Its tin roof sagged slightly at one corner, its wooden door had darkened from years of weather, and moss grew between the lower bricks like green threads stitching the place to the earth. Behind it, the abandoned apple orchard stretched into the fog, rows of bare trees standing with their branches lifted like hands that had forgotten what they were reaching for. Ethan picked up Ruth Whitmore's brass key and the tiny washer stamped with an apple tree. Both rested heavy in his palm, though together they could not have weighed more than a few ounces. Atlas stood beside him outside the truck before Ethan had even closed the door, silver gray and cream coat dampened by the mist, dark working harness catching the dull shine of the porch light Ethan carried from the cab. The German shepherd did not rush toward the entrance. He walked slowly along the stone path, nose low, ears forward, listening with his whole body. Ethan followed with Helen Brooks's flashlight in one hand and Ruth's old photograph tucked inside his faded olive jacket. The air smelled of wet leaves, old brick, rusted metal, and something faintly clean beneath it all, like soap remembered by stone. At the door, Ethan slid the key into the lock. It turned more easily than he expected, with a soft click that sounded almost new. The door opened inward, and the breath of the wash house met him. Cold air rolled out, carrying the scent of rainwater, dried lavender, old wood, iron pipes, and cloths stored too long in darkness. His flashlight beam crossed the room slowly. There were shelves along one wall, a cracked enamel basin on iron legs, a line of wooden pegs where washboards once hung, a rusted stove, folded canvas, a stack of crates, and a stone trough at the back beneath a boarded window. Dust lay over everything, but not the wild, careless dust of true abandonment. This dust seemed settled over order, as if someone had closed the room carefully and trusted time not to disturb it. Atlas stepped inside, paused, and lifted his head toward the back wall. Ethan unfolded the photograph and held it toward the flashlight. In the old picture, Ruth and her husband stood near that same stone trough, bright in summer, the younger German shepherd seated beside a low vent near the floor. Ethan looked up from the photograph to the present room. The vent was gone. In its place was a patch of brick that did not quite match the rest of the wall. The mortar was smoother, newer, and faintly darker, as if someone had sealed the mouth and hoped no one would remember it had once spoken. Atlas moved to the trough and placed one paw on the floor beside it. He did not bark. He waited. Ethan knelt, setting the flashlight across a crate so its beam washed over the cracked tiles. The floor near the trough was made of square red clay tiles, worn pale in the center from years of feet, buckets, and running water. One tile at the rear edge was different. Not by color, not enough for most eyes, but by sound. Atlas tapped it once with his paw. A low, hollow note answered beneath the floor. Ethan swallowed. The note was soft, almost polite, but it traveled up through the tile and into his hand when he touched it. Ruth's line returned to him. Let Atlas listen where the water stopped. Ethan sat back on his heels and forced himself not to pry at the tile immediately. Do not force the floor. Listen first. So he listened. The washhouse creaked gently in the wind. Water dripped somewhere outside from the tin roof. Atlas breathed slow and deep beside him. Then, from beneath the trough, came a second sound, not a knock, not a warning, but the faint settling of metal against stone. Ethan pulled the brass washer from his pocket and studied the stamped apple tree. Near the base of the trough, hidden behind a curtain of cobwebs and old lime scale, he found a round depression in the iron frame. The washer fit perfectly. When he pressed it in, something inside the wall shifted with a careful mechanical click. The mismatched brick panel beside the trough loosened a quarter-inch. Ethan stared at it, his breath caught in his chest. Atlas stepped closer, nose almost touching the opening, then looked back at him with eyes bright and steady. Ethan pulled gently on the edge of the panel. It opened outward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow space behind the wall and an iron handle set into the floor. Cool, dry air rose through the crack, carrying the smell of cedar, paper, and earth untouched by rain. Ethan lifted the handle slowly. A round metal hatch came free beneath the tile, heavier than it looked but balanced by old springs that still remembered their work. Below it, a stone stairway descended into darkness, clean and narrow, with a copper pipe running along the wall like a guide rail. On the first steps sat a folded card, protected in a glassine sleeve. Ethan picked it up and read Ruth's handwriting in the flashlight beam. If you found this, then Atlas heard what fear tried to bury. Go down with a gentle heart. The truth was never meant for the loudest man in town. Ethan stood at the mouth of the hidden stairway, rain whispering on the roof above him, Atlas waiting at his side, and the $1 building no longer felt like a joke. It felt like a secret that had finally recognized the person meant to carry it. Ethan descended the stone stairway with Atlas just ahead of him, the flashlight beam trembling over the copper pipe, the clean-cut steps, and the old brick walls that seemed untouched by the dampness above. The air below the Whitmore washhouse was not stale. That surprised him first. It was cool and dry, carrying the scent of cedar boards, old paper, machine oil, and something faintly sweet, like apples stored in wooden crates through a long winter. Each step took him farther from the sound of rain on the tin roof and deeper into a silence that felt prepared rather than empty. Atlas reached the bottom and waited, his ears forward, his silver gray and cream coat catching the soft spill of light from Ethan's flashlight. At the end of the short passage stood a narrow wooden door with an iron latch and a small apple tree carved into the center panel. Ethan touched the carving with 2 fingers. The wood was smooth, worn not by weather but by hands. He lifted the latch. The door opened with a gentle sigh. Beyond it lay a room no one in Pine Hollow would have believed existed beneath a $1 wash house. Cedar shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Metal boxes sat in careful rows. A long table stood in the center, covered with maps, ledgers, old envelopes, town records, and photographs protected in clear sleeves. Along the far wall were practical things: folded blankets, canned food, kerosene lamps, toolkits, winter coats, spare boots, children's gloves, and neatly labeled bins of small household parts. Faucet washers, stove knobs, heater fuses, window latches. Simple pieces that could keep a poor family from losing warmth, water, or dignity. Ethan stood in the doorway, unable to move for a moment. He had expected perhaps a cellar, perhaps a forgotten trunk, perhaps proof that Ruth Whitmore had been eccentric in the way lonely old people sometimes became when memory had more company than neighbors. But this room was not eccentric. It was organized mercy. Atlas walked to the long table and placed his nose near a leather ledger, then looked back at Ethan. On the front cover, stamped in fading gold, were the words Whitmore Community Repair Trust. Ethan opened it carefully. The first page was dated 1956. Ruth's handwriting was younger there, stronger, each letter neat and upright. Samuel says a broken thing can become the excuse that lets kindness enter a house. We will repair what we can, and when repair is not enough, we will help people stay standing. Ethan turned the page. Names filled the ledger, not famous names, not rich names, just ordinary people written down with extraordinary care. A veteran whose furnace had failed in February. A widowed mother whose washing machine was repaired before she lost her job at the diner. A mill worker given boots, bus fare, and 3 nights in the back room of the farmhouse. A family whose car was fixed at no charge after a medical bill emptied their savings. Beside many entries, Ruth had written paid later, paid in preserves, paid with prayer, or forgiven quietly. Ethan felt his throat tighten. The room seemed to know him in a way people rarely did. It knew the cost of a small broken part. It knew how quickly a loose wire, a dead heater, or a bad tire could become the first step toward losing everything. He walked along the shelves, shining his light over photographs pinned to a corkboard. Ruth and Samuel stood outside the wash house with neighbors, veterans, mechanics, nurses, children, farmers, and strangers who looked uncertain in one picture and steadier in the next. In several photographs, a German shepherd sat near the doorway, calm and watchful. Moses. Then another shepherd in later years. Then another. Ruth had not simply loved dogs. She had trusted them to recognize what people hid. At the back of the room stood a gray filing cabinet with a newer lock and a brass plate marked Mercer Development Fund. Atlas stopped in front of it and gave a low sound, not a growl, but a question. Ethan tried the drawer. Locked. On the table beside it was a sealed envelope addressed to Helen Brooks. Underneath was another, smaller note addressed to Ethan. He opened his note first, hands careful despite the grease still dark beneath his nails. Ethan, if Atlas brought you here, then the truth has chosen patience over power. Do not open the Mercer files alone. Bring Helen. What is inside will explain why some men wanted this building priced like a joke, and why I needed someone who understood the value of a warm room more than the shine of a rich offer. Ethan folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket, close to his chest. Atlas came to him and rested his head lightly against Ethan's thigh. Above them, rain whispered over the roof of the old wash house, but down there, in the hidden room of ledgers, coats, tools, and forgiven debts, Ethan felt something begin to return to him. Not money. Not certainty. Something quieter and stronger. The belief that his kindness had not made him foolish. It had made him findable. Ethan did not open the Mercer cabinet. The lock looked small enough to challenge with the tools in his truck, and the mechanic in him knew 3 different ways to coax it open without leaving a mark, but Ruth's instruction held his hand still. Do not open the Mercer files alone. Bring Helen. It was strange how a dead woman's handwriting could carry more authority than a living man's threat. Ethan placed the envelope addressed to Helen on the long table, weighting it with a smooth river stone that had been used as a paperweight, then walked slowly through the hidden room one more time with Atlas at his side. The flashlight passed over the shelves of heater fuses, faucet washers, canned soup, blankets, gloves, old ledgers, and photographs of people who had once stood in the doorway of hardship and found someone waiting with a tool kit instead of a lecture. The room did not feel like a secret kept for pride. It felt like a lamp hidden during a storm so it would still be burning when the right traveler arrived. Above them, rain softened to a mist, tapping the tin roof in fewer and fewer notes. Ethan climbed back into the washhouse and closed the hatch halfway, leaving it resting loose beneath the mismatched tiles so he could reach the room again without disturbing the mechanism. He brought in the wool blanket Helen had given him, Atlas's food, his thermos, and the canvas tool bag that held almost everything left from his old life. The washhouse was cold, but not cruel. He made a place for himself beside the stone basin, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and leaned against the brick wall where Ruth's hidden panel had opened. Atlas ate quietly, drank from a bowl Ethan filled with bottled water from the truck, then lay down with his body between Ethan and the door. For a long time, Ethan stayed awake, listening to the old building breathe. The pipes gave soft clicks as the temperature dropped. The tin roof whispered under the last of the mist. Somewhere in the orchard, a branch scraped lightly against another branch, patient and rhythmic. He thought of Carl Mercer's envelope, of the $500 that would have bought a motel room, a warm meal, fuel, and dog food. He thought of how close he had come to taking it. Then he looked toward the hidden stairway and understood that some offers are designed to rescue a man from discomfort, while stealing the very thing meant to restore him. Near midnight, Atlas lifted his head. Ethan opened his eyes. The dog was not alarmed. He was listening toward the floor, ears angled, amber eyes catching the faint glow of the flashlight. From below came a small sound, not the hollow note from before, but a settling of paper or metal, as if the hidden room had turned in its sleep. Ethan placed a hand on Atlas's neck. "We wait for Helen," he whispered. Atlas lowered his head again, and somehow that was enough. Dawn came pale and blue through the boarded window, touching the dust on the stone basin and turning the old wash-house gentle. Ethan woke with a stiff back but a clearer heart than he had carried in months. He had spent the night on the property. He had kept Ruth's condition. He had not sold, abandoned, forced, or opened what he was told to protect. After feeding Atlas, he stepped outside into the wet orchard and called Helen Brooks. She answered with the quickness of someone who had slept beside her phone. "I found something," Ethan said. "Beneath the wash house. Ruth left an envelope for you." Helen was silent for one breath. Then she said, "I will be there in 30 minutes. She arrived in a dark green sedan just as sunlight broke through the clouds and laid a faint gold edge across the old apple trees. Helen wore a long gray coat and carried a leather document case against her chest. When she entered the wash house and saw the open wall panel, the exposed hatch, and Atlas sitting beside it like a guardian, her face changed. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. "Ruth always said the building remembered," she murmured. Ethan led her down the stone stairs. Helen moved carefully, one hand on the copper pipe, and when the hidden room opened before her, she stopped at the threshold. Her eyes traveled over the ledgers, the coats, the repair bins, the photographs, and the words Whitmore Community Repair Trust stamped across the leather book. She pressed one hand to her mouth, then lowered it slowly. "She kept it alive," Helen whispered. "All these years." Ethan gave her the envelope. Helen opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a key, a trust summary, and a note from Ruth. "Helen, if Ethan and Atlas found the room, file everything. The Mercer cabinet holds the missing proof. Do not let them call Mercy inactive." Helen wiped at one eye with the back of her hand, then stepped to the gray cabinet. The key turned with a clear click. The drawer opened smoothly, releasing the smell of oilcloth and old paper. Inside were land records, bank statements, council minutes, donation logs, and signed agreements linking the wash house, the orchard, and several surrounding lots to a repair and housing trust that had never legally expired. Helen read quickly at first, then slower, her face tightening with every page. Ethan waited beside Atlas, afraid to ask the question forming in the room. Finally Helen looked up. Carl Mercer did not just want the land, she said softly. His development fund could only claim it if these records stayed hidden. Ruth chose you because you kept fixing what others wanted to profit from. Ethan looked around at the quiet shelves, the spare parts, the folded coats, the names of people helped and forgiven. The $1 inheritance had not been a joke. It had been a test of whether a man who had almost nothing would still protect something priceless. Helen gathered the Mercer files with the careful speed of someone who understood that paper could become shelter if it reached the right desk in time. Ethan watched her wrap the land records, bank statements, old council minutes, and trust agreements back in oilcloth, each bundle tied with cotton string that Ruth had labeled in a hand grown thinner but never careless. Atlas sat by the gray cabinet, calm and upright, his silver gray and cream coat brushed by the warm beam of the flashlight, his amber eyes following Helen as if he knew the room had finally finished whispering and was ready to speak aloud. Ethan felt the strange weight of the morning pressing on him. The wash house above them was still valued at $1 on paper. His wallet still held almost nothing. His truck still needed work. Carl Mercer had still fired him the day before. Yet the hidden room had changed the shape of all those facts. Poverty had made him vulnerable, but it had not made him blind. Loss had brought him to the door, but kindness had made him trusted enough to open it. Helen closed her leather document case and looked around the room one more time. "We need to file certified copies today," she said. "Once these are in the county record, the development fund cannot claim ignorance or inactivity." Ethan nodded, though the legal words felt distant compared with the names in the ledger and the bins of spare parts waiting on the shelves. "What happens after that?" Helen looked toward the stairs. "After that, people who thought this place was dead will have to explain why they buried a living trust." Atlas rose before either of them heard the vehicle. His ears lifted toward the ceiling. A few seconds later, gravel crackled outside the washhouse, followed by the muted sound of a car door closing. Helen went still. Ethan dimmed the flashlight and looked up the stairway. A familiar voice called from above, smooth enough to sound friendly to anyone who did not know its edges. "Ethan," Carl Mercer said, "are you in there? I wanted to check on you. Make sure Ruth's little building did not collapse around your pride." Ethan looked at Helen. She held the document case tighter against her coat. "Do not show him the originals," she whispered. They climbed the stairs slowly, Atlas ahead of them, quiet as a shadow. When Ethan stepped back into the wash house, daylight through the boarded window painted the room in pale strips. Carl stood near the door in a dark raincoat, looking out of place among the stone basin, cracked tiles, old shelves, and damp brick. His eyes moved quickly over the room, pausing on the shifted tile near the trough, the open wall panel, the dust on Ethan's sleeves, and finally Helen's leather case. For the first time since Ethan had known him, Carl did not look amused. "Busy morning," Carl said. Helen answered before Ethan could. "This is private property under an active estate condition. You need to leave." Carl smiled at her. "Helen, surely we can be practical. Ethan had a hard day yesterday. He is tired, unemployed, and standing in a building that will drain money faster than rain through that roof. I came to improve my offer." He reached inside his coat and took out a folded document, not an envelope this time, but a prepared purchase agreement with bright tabs marking places for signatures. $5,000, he said to Ethan. "Today. Enough to fix that truck, buy food for the dog, maybe start over somewhere with less history pressing on your back." Ethan looked at the paper, then at Atlas standing beside the stone basin, the very place where Ruth's hidden door had opened. A day earlier, $5,000 would have sounded like rescue. Now it sounded like a curtain being offered to cover a window. "I am not selling," Ethan said. Carl's expression hardened by a fraction. "You do not know what you are saying no to." "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "I think I finally do." Helen stepped forward, her voice formal now, each word measured. "Mr. Mercer, Ruth Whitmore preserved the original documents for the Whitmore Community Repair Trust. The wash house, orchard access, and adjoining parcels remain bound to its public purpose unless a court says otherwise. I will file certified copies this afternoon." Carl's face changed so quickly that an untrained eye might have missed it. Atlas did not miss it. The dog took one step closer to Ethan, steady and watchful. Carl lowered the purchase agreement. "Old papers can be misunderstood," he said. "Old kindness can be underestimated," Helen replied. The rain had stopped outside, and in the silence that followed, Ethan heard water drip from the tin roof into the grass. He thought of Ruth writing by lamplight, of Samuel saving receipts, of families who had walked out of this wash-house warmer than they entered, of Atlas tapping the tile until the floor gave back its truth. Carl looked from Helen to Ethan, then toward the hidden panel with a stare that no longer pretended innocence. "This will become messy," he said. Ethan rested one hand on Atlas's harness. "Maybe it needs to become honest first." Carl had no answer that fit the room. He folded the agreement slowly, turned, and stepped back into the gray morning. When his car disappeared down the orchard lane, Helen released a long breath. Ethan stood in the doorway of the wash-house, watching sunlight gather on the wet apple branches. The truth had survived the dark. Now it had to survive daylight. Helen drove straight to the county records office with the Mercer files secured in her leather case, and Ethan followed in the old blue pickup with Atlas beside him, the dog sitting upright as if the road itself had become part of his duty. Pine Hollow looked ordinary in the late morning light, with wet sidewalks, flags stirring over storefronts, and people carrying paper coffee cups beneath a sky slowly clearing after rain, but Ethan felt as though something hidden beneath the town had shifted. The same streets that had watched him lose his job now watched him return with proof that a $1 building had been holding a promise worth more than any offer Carl Mercer could place in an envelope. At the records office, Helen moved with calm precision. She requested certified filing, placed the original trust documents under review, and gave the clerk copies of the land maps, donation records, council minutes, and the pages that tied the Whitmore wash house, the orchard access, and several surrounding lots to a public repair and housing purpose. The clerk, a woman with silver glasses and a cardigan buttoned to the throat, read the first few pages with polite interest, then slowed, then looked up at Ethan with a different expression. Not pity. Not doubt. Recognition. "This trust was never closed," she said quietly. Helen nodded. "That is exactly what Mrs. Whitmore wanted the county to see." By afternoon, the news had spread through Pine Hollow faster than the rainwater leaving the gutters. The mayor called an emergency meeting in the community room above the fire station, and by 4 o'clock, folding chairs had filled with shop owners, retirees, town clerks, mechanics, church volunteers, and people who had only heard enough to know that Ruth Whitmore's forgotten wash house was suddenly no longer a joke. Ethan stood near the back wall at first, one hand resting lightly on Atlas's harness. He still wore his faded olive jacket, faded work shirt, worn jeans, and rugged boots, and he felt more comfortable beside a broken engine than in a room waiting for him to speak. Carl Mercer sat near the front in a dark coat, his face arranged into concern, though his fingers tapped once against his knee whenever Helen laid another document on the table. Helen did not accuse. She explained. She spoke of Ruth and Samuel Whitmore, of a community repair trust created to help veterans, laid-off workers, widows, families without heat, and neighbors whose lives could be changed by a working furnace, a running car, a dry roof, or one more month in their home. She showed the original filings, the repair logs, the orchard access rights, and the development fund papers that had attempted to treat the trust as inactive. The room grew quieter with every page. Carl finally stood and smoothed his coat. "Sentiment is powerful," he said, "but towns cannot live on nostalgia. Pine Hollow needs growth." Ethan looked at him, then at the people in the room, then down at Atlas. The German shepherd's amber eyes were steady, not urging, not demanding, only reminding him that truth had already done the hard work of being found. Ethan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. "Ruth did not leave nostalgia under that wash house," he said. "She left records of people who needed help before they lost everything. She left parts for heaters, blankets for cold nights, ledgers of repairs that kept families working, and proof that this town once knew how to fix more than machines. The words settled into the room like warm light. Marcy Lane, the woman whose car Ethan had repaired the day before, stood near the side aisle. "He helped me when I could not afford another bill," she said. "He did not make me feel small for needing it." An older man near the coffee table lifted his hand. "My father got his truck fixed at the Whitmore place after the mills shut down. We never knew who paid for the parts." Another woman remembered Ruth bringing blankets after an ice storm. A retired teacher remembered students whose families received groceries without anyone announcing it. One memory called another forward until the room no longer belonged to Carl's polished explanation. It belonged to the quiet truth of what Mercy had done when no one was keeping score. The mayor finally said the development fund review would be paused pending legal examination of the restored trust. Helen closed her folder. Carl sat down slowly. Ethan felt no triumph. Triumph would have been too loud for what Ruth had protected. What he felt was steadier, like the first good board laid across a broken floor. That evening, he returned to the Whitmore washhouse with Atlas as the clouds opened to a pale gold sunset over the wet apple trees. He unlocked the wooden door, stepped inside, and listened. The little building was still old, still cold, still smelling of soap, brick, and rain, but it no longer felt forgotten. Atlas walked to the stone basin, sat beside the hidden panel, and looked back at Ethan as if to say the truth had reached daylight. Now kindness had to learn how to stay. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore washhouse changed slowly, the way an old heart begins beating again after years of silence. No one transformed it into something shiny or strange. Ethan would not allow that. The brick walls remained weathered, the tin roof still sang softly when rain passed over the orchard, and the stone basin stayed exactly where Atlas had first heard the hidden truth beneath the floor. What changed was the light. Helen Brooks completed the first legal filings, and after the county confirmed the trust was active enough to receive emergency protection, volunteers began arriving before Ethan knew what to do with them. Marcy Lane came with coffee, 2 boxes of clean towels, and her children carrying labels for shelves. The retired teacher brought folding chairs from the church basement. A plumber from the next town repaired the old water line for less than the parts cost. A veteran Ethan had never met drove in from 20 miles away with a truckload of scrap lumber, and said only that he had once been helped by a place like this and had been waiting years to pay the debt forward. Ethan worked from sunrise until his hands ached, repairing windows, sealing the roof, rewiring safe lights, sanding the old table, sorting heater fuses and faucet washers into bins Ruth would have approved of. Atlas moved everywhere with him, calm and watchful in his dark working harness, sometimes resting beside the stone basin, sometimes sitting near the door as people came and went. At first, Ethan slept in the pickup parked beside the orchard because that was what he knew how to do. On the 4th night, Helen found him there before dawn, fog on the windows and Atlas curled against the seat. She said nothing sharp. She simply walked him inside, pointed to the narrow cot in the hidden room, and told him Ruth had not preserved blankets for a man to freeze 10 yards from them. Ethan tried to argue, then stopped. Some kindnesses were not meant to be refused forever. By the first real snowfall, the wash house was ready enough to open, not perfect, not finished, but warm, useful, and honest. A hand-carved sign hung beside the door, Whitmore Repair Room, rest first, explained later. Ethan had carved the words himself, copying them from Ruth's ledgers with the careful concentration of a man rebuilding more than wood. Inside, a coffee pot steamed on a small counter. Soup warmed in a slow cooker. Coats hung by size along the wall. The workbench held donated tools, clean rags, and small parts that could save a family from a cold house or a car that would not start. Downstairs, the hidden room remained protected, no longer a secret of fear, but a quiet archive of mercy. The ledger lay open to a new page. Ethan stood over it on opening evening while snow fell beyond the windows and warm light touched the old brick. He still wore his faded olive jacket, faded work shirt, worn jeans, and rugged boots. His short brown hair, touched by gray near the temples, was damp from carrying firewood. His light stubble shadowed a face that had not become younger, only less burdened. Atlas sat beside him, silver gray and cream coat glowing in the lamplight, amber eyes following every person who entered as if weighing whether they had come in need, gratitude, or both. Marcy's children placed cups beside the coffee pot. Helen set Ruth's photograph on a shelf near the brass key and the washer stamped with the apple tree. People came quietly, some with donations, some with repair requests, some with no words at all. One man brought a broken space heater and stood embarrassed until Ethan took it from his hands and said, "Let us see what it remembers." The man smiled then, small and shaken, as if dignity had been returned in a language he understood. Later, when the room emptied and only the low sound of wind moved through the orchard, Ethan opened the ledger and wrote the first entry of the restored trust. Opened tonight. Coffee served. 3 coats given. 1 heater repaired. 1 family returning tomorrow for help with a car. Atlas found the truth first. He paused with the pen in his hand, listening to the soft tick of the roof, the old pipes, the faint sleeping hush of the hidden room below. Carl Mercer's name no longer filled the space. The shame of being fired no longer owned the day. The $1 value on the estate paper had become almost holy to Ethan now, not because it measured the building, but because it proved how poorly the world understood the price of mercy. Atlas leaned against his leg, warm and steady. Ethan rested his palm on the dog's head and looked toward the door where one small lamp had been left burning for whoever might come next. He had thought the inheritance was a joke because he had forgotten that miracles often arrive dressed as something no one else wants. But Ruth had known. Atlas had known. And now Ethan knew too. Kindness can be buried, mocked, priced at $1, and left in the rain, but when the right heart stays long enough to listen, the truth always finds its way back into the light.